Hello, everyone. So this is the first review lecture that I'm presenting this week, and it's going to be on comparing and contrasting artworks and monuments. Slide comparisons is a very common technique in art history, and it allows you to compare and contrast artworks or monuments in terms of their visual content, their location, their materials and technologies of production and function, conventions of representation, and so on. And so each of these comparisons are actually they're specifically meant to be bringing out particular problems, particular race-specific questions and issues about the two artworks when they are put together. So what we're doing in these comparisons is basically putting two works of art to conversation between each other, to put them together and compare. And I'd like you to sort of really improve your skills in pointing out these kind of material, visual, and formal similarities and differences. Some of these differences are crucial to the identity of the work. For example, the influence of ancient art let's say I'm putting here a number of prehistoric figurines, both from the Paleolithic period, Upper Paleolithic, but also and the Neolithic, but also a piece of sculpture from Brancusi. And so we can actually formally compare these pieces, right? So let's look at some of the examples that we've covered in class, and these are the kinds of comparisons that you will get in your midterm. Let's look at the first example, comparing the stele of Naram Sin to the stele of Eannatum. This is something that we considered just recently. The first thing that really strikes me is the convention of representation, how a particular historical event is represented in either of them. In the stele of Eannatum, we have this register style of representation, which presents this space to us in these stages, in registers, and they're kind of really an abstract horizontal space where the historical event is taking place, but it's introduced to us as a kind of an episodic narrative, right? Whereas in the stele of Naram Sin, we see actually the entire scene of the narrative combined in a landscape representation, right? It's in the form of a mountain where the action and the result of the action, all of these things are really combined and put together in one scene. Another interesting point of comparison here is the image of the kingship, right? So on the right, in the stele of Eannatum, we see Eannatum in this kind of ceremonial sheepskin garb, and kind of really that leaves one of his arms exposed. And he is in this kind of attack mode on the top two representations, where we see him more clearly, and he's leading his army, right? He's kind of really active. And look at his proportions. We don't really see any musculature. We just recognize him from his garb, and his headdress and everything. Whereas on the left, with the stele of Naram Sin, we are actually seeing Naram Sin as really sexualized body, male sort of body, with a kind of a horned helmet, which really announces Naram Sin to be a divine figure. So this is a radical change in terms of how kings are represented. The way that the historical event is presented here is interesting. Both are actually showing us a military conflict, but one of them is in this sort of really this complete view of the mountain where it's taking place. So there's a spatial sort of framing of the war, whereas on the right we're actually seeing an episodic narrative. The preservation status is interesting. The stele of Eannatum is preserved in fragments that we then put together, whereas the stele of Naram Sin is well preserved as a whole. The role of the text in each of these monuments are very interesting. On the stele of Naram Sin, we have a very short, small inscription that identifies what's going on and the dedication. Whereas in the stele of Eannatum, the entire stele, back and on four sides, is inscribed in the areas that are left over from the images, and that in a way sort of really wraps, so that the text is much more extensive. It gives yet another sort of legal account of the war, apart from the visual representation. So this is very, very important. And finally, maybe the role of gods. If you remember, on the other side, on the reverse side of the stele of Eannatum, we have a massive anthropomorphic human-shaped image of Ningirsu and his mother Ninhursag, who are also sort of really winning this battle, right? Whereas in the stele of Naram Sin, we actually see those gods being reduced to pictorial symbols like the little sun on top, that are, so the gods there are not shown as humans anymore, they're shown as symbolic images. So let's go to the other comparison. You'll remember this from last week. This comparison, on the other hand, really gives us a different sort of, the importance here is the medium, right? On the left-hand side, we actually have a stele, what we call a stele, that is a very urban monument, that's human scale, that's kind of relatively more where the entire scene is readable and it's in front of you. Whereas on the right, we have a rock relief, which is an entirely different medium. The carving of a monument into the living rock is what's really happening here. And so the scale is much larger, larger than the kind of really human scale that we're actually seeing. The context then is very different. On the left-hand side, we have an urban monument. On the right-hand side, we have something deep into the countryside, maybe in a mountain pass, or a river gorge or something like that. What's really similar in both of them is you will recognize the representation of the king and his gesture and his attire, right? So the king is stepping up on the mountain and stepping over the enemies in both of them. And in somehow, if you look at the bodily gestures, there's a shared sort of representation of the king and how he's portrayed. And so we want to really think very carefully about this gesture and the clothing and the representation of the king with the long beard and the helmet and so on. Yeah, so the here, although they're both kind of, we're seeing these scenes being carved on stone. On the one on the right, we have something that's carved directly on the mountain. On the left, we have a monument that is set up in maybe a public space, or in a temple courtyard, or the entrance of the city gate, something like that. In this comparison, I'd like to sort of really, what is really fascinating is that we have two upright standing animals, really pretending to be to have an uprightness that looks like a human. So it's a little bit anthropomorphizing aspect of an animal. On the left, we have this royal tombs of Ur object, goat with a flowering plant, and on the right we have a hybrid lion human creature, which is a statuette, which is a small figurine from the Upper Paleolithic in Germany. So they're set quite apart. The statuette, the Paleolithic figurine, is made of mammoth ivory, and it dates to really old, 30,000 years ago, whereas the goat with a flowering plant is actually early Bronze Age, from the royal tombs of Ur. It's 2550 to 2400, and the really significant difference in terms of their archaeological context is important. The goat is found in a burial, in a royal burial, buried with, and probably made for that burial, buried with a king or a queen, whereas the hybrid creature, the lion man, is actually was found in a campsite in Germany, from a campsite of a hunting-gathering community. So the archaeological context, the temporality, the chronology of these two works of art are actually really fundamentally different. In terms of function, we see a major difference. One is really made for burial, for a royal burial. The other one probably had some kind of an everyday, some magical function within the everyday use. And also, finally, maybe to talk about technology, right? On the goat is actually a composite figure, which is made with gold, silver, lapis lazuli, copper alloy, and shell. So a lot of combination of a lot of different kinds of materials put together, particularly metal technologies put together with other kind of stones and shell as well, and bitumen. Whereas the entire statuette, Paleolithic statuette, is carved from a mammoth ivory. So that's very, very different. Here's an architectural comparison. I'm showing you two temples. On the left, we have the White Temple from Uruk that we talked about in our class. On the right, we have the Temple Oval from Kafage. Both are temples that are raised on a particular platform, although the White Temple at Uruk is actually raised on a platform that's actually a kind of really encapsulates and covers earlier building phases of the same temple, whereas the Temple Oval at Kafage, if you remember, was an innovation. They had raised down in a neighborhood in Kafage and built this temple in terraces. So one major difference then between these two temple complexes is that the White Temple at Uruk is actually on one terrace, whereas the Temple Oval at Kafage is organized around a series of succeeding courtyards, starting with a lower courtyard and a gate with a house complex, and then you get into a higher courtyard within the higher platform, and then you finally go up to the third platform where you find the shrine. A major difference is that there are the temple building at Uruk. The White Temple is very well preserved, the mud brick building, whereas the building on the very top of the Temple Oval is in fact not surviving. So that's actually a hypothetical reconstruction that we're seeing. We know that the White Temple at Uruk is actually dedicated to a god, Anu, and we know that from textual evidence. and we're pretty confident about that. Whereas the temple oval at Carthage, we don't have written evidence, and we have no idea which god or goddess it was dedicated to. So that's another important distinction. We know in terms of thinking about temple as an urban institution, they share the characteristics of the temple as an economic institution and a ceremonial center within the urban space, and they share that idea between them. So here's a comparison that actually provokes us to talk about pictorial representation, visual and pictorial narrative. They're both sponsored by kings. On the left-hand side, we have the Standard of Ur, which is actually excavated in, again, a royal burial, like the goat that we just talked about. And it has a representation of these three registers depicting a banquet scene and some dedications of animals and foodstuffs being brought up to the king. Whereas the wall plaque of Ur-Nanshe and his family, we have a limestone plaque that was actually put up in a temple. And we see that, again, this kind of a register representation is used in terms of a visual convention. The difference is that we have two registers in the wall plaque, and that is slightly, that kind of the strict separation between upper and lower register is somehow really innovatively integrated to each other by actually sort of crossing that line. And so what's really quite interesting is that we also, that's similar in both of them, is the feasting scene. In the lower register of the Ur-Nanshe plaque, we have Ur-Nanshe drinking and being merry and sort of really being with his family and in this kind of really feasting scene. Whereas in the Standard of Ur, the king is sitting with his officers and maybe with his family as well, and having a banquet that's actually taking place. The Standard of Ur was buried with a king in a burial, in a royal burial, whereas the Ur-Nanshe plaque was actually as a stone plaque that was put up on the wall of a temple. The Standard of Ur is made of composite materials, shell, lapis lazuli, red limestone, and bitumen, whereas the wall plaque is carved out of stone. So we see a lot of parallels, but a lot of differences as well. So all you have to do is really to point out these differences. Here's a really interesting example of shared iconography, one object from Egypt and one object from Mesopotamia. On the left, we have the Jebel al-Arak knife that was found in Egypt, dating to the middle of the 4th millennium. On the right-hand side, roughly contemporary the Uruk stele, a basalt boulder on which the image of the priest king is depicted hunting lions. And so on the left-hand side, what's really quite interesting is that this priest king, which is very well known from Mesopotamia, is actually depicted in this Egyptian artifact on the knife, on the ivory handle of the, carved on the ivory handle of the knife, is sort of dominating two, controlling and dominating two lions in this kind of symmetrical pose. Whereas on the right, the same priest king, whom we identify from his long beard, his bun, and his attire. We see him hunting a lion first in the lower register with bow and arrow, on the upper register with a spear. So in both cases, he's engaging with lions. In one of them, he's hunting them. In the other, he is in this kind of really dominating pose. What these two monuments two objects actually raise for us, one ivory and the other stone, is this interaction between Egypt and Mesopotamia, and that they shared this idea of the priest king around 3300 BCE. Another comparison, also architectural comparison, we're looking at. We have this problem of the early and the late Neolithic in the Middle East. That's actually being illustrated by this comparison. On the left-hand side, we have the seasonal mountain sanctuary of Göbekli Tepe, the hunter-gatherer community that is dated from 9,600 to 7,300. And on the right, we have Çatalhöyük, which actually is much later, as you can see, from the latter part of the Neolithic period. The first one, Göbekli Tepe, actually dates to the time period where we don't have evidence for domestication of plants and animals, whereas on the right, Çatalhöyük is actually precisely one of the earliest settlements of an agricultural community. So that's really, these two settlements are actually presenting to us a kind of two different episodes within the prehistoric period. On the left-hand side in Göbekli Tepe, what we see actually is a monumental building with T-shaped pillars, circular stone walls, embedded within actually a stone quarry, most probably used as some kind of a cult or ritual building where large groups of people did feasting. So these are not houses on the left-hand side in Göbekli Tepe, but those are public buildings. Whereas on the right-hand side in Çatalhöyük, the buildings that we see are houses that are kind of really built up against each other, forming a really interesting, kind of dense neighborhood of a large village. The materials are different. The materials of construction are different. Göbekli Tepe buildings are either built with these stones, rubble stone masonry walls with carved T-shaped pillars. On the right-hand side, Çatalhöyük buildings were built actually with mud brick. So there is a major architectural technology and material difference between the two, as we can see. And so the last comparison I have here is between the small handheld figure of the Neolithic, the nude female figure from Çatalhöyük. That was a recent find dated to 6300 to 6100 BCE, which presents us an interesting example of an ideal image of a female figure. Whereas on the right, you have votive statues from Tel Asmar, from the Abu Temple in Tel Asmar, which are made from gypsum. And so these are votive statues of particular prominent urban elites from the city of Tel Asmar. So in terms of we have two different functions that's going on with the nude female figurine. We have a figurine that can be held within the palm of your hand, and this figurine was buried in a house. Whereas with the votive statues in Tel Asmar, we're actually seeing a horde of statues that were buried in a temple complex. and they were buried all together once their sort of functionality was over. And so if we look at the representation of the human body in either of them, the nude female figure has these voluptuous features, right? The sagging belly, large buttocks and large belly, the pendulous breasts that she's holding with her hands, and this very slightly configured face. And a prominent belly button, right? It's a nude female figurine. On the right-hand side, the votive statues of Tel Asmar, on the other hand, are all clothed, both male and female figures. And the male figures have these kind of long hair and long beards, and then they are in this kind of really prayer gesture, whereas the nude female figure is simply holding her breasts. These guys are all have their clasped hands in front of them in a gesture of prayer, and they're probably holding some kind of a libation cup. And then they're depending on their gender, they're actually wearing different kinds of these kind of long dresses. And the nude female figure from Çatalhöyük is actually just completely carved out of marble, whereas crystallized limestone, whereas the votive statues from Tel Asmar are actually carved out of gypsum, but they have their eyes that are inlaid with these kind of with lapis lazuli and shell, which make them their vision, their eyes very prominent in the design, in the kind of visual design of their posture, and so this in a way presents us actually two different conventions of the representation of the body in these two cultures. And of course they're chronologically set apart. The nude female figure comes from a Neolithic site, Çatalhöyük, and an early agricultural community before the invention of writing, so before history, whereas the votive statues of Tel Asmar come from an urban literate culture, and these statues are dedicated to a temple. Whereas the nude female figure, we have no idea it has any religious affiliation or not. So this kind of really these are the examples that I wanted to sort of really present to you and give as an example of how we can sort of really do these comparisons. So thank you, and we will discuss more examples on Thursday.